Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If this is your first time here, my name's Alec Glennis. I'm a hybrid athlete training for a sub 2:30 marathon while building muscle. I'm also a coach, an educator, and this week I'm back with a video for you guys on VO2Max. Now VO2Max is a trending topic these days, and as with most trending topics, the pendulum has swung back and forth between two groups making some very strong claims. On one hand, we have wellness gurus and podcasters saying things like VO2Max is the most important thing for longevity. They push people towards all chasing top 1% VO2Maxes. They have VO2Max protocols to make it as high as possible. Think like the Norwegian 4x4 and Tabata, etc. And then on the other hand, you have people pushing back against that, saying things like VO2Max doesn't matter. It's just an artifact of living a healthy lifestyle. And if you get 10,000 steps and maintain a healthy body composition, then cardio is overrated and doesn't have much to offer you in terms of longevity. My goal with this video is to offer some nuance, bring some middle ground to that conversation. My goal is not to overhype or sensationalize anything or make any claims stronger than the evidence can actually support. I'm going to push back against some common myths and misconceptions about VO2Max and hopefully make it practical for you guys, both in terms of health and performance. Before we talk about VO2Max, there's something else very important we have to discuss first, and that's the 1904 Hanoi rat massacre. Now you're probably thinking, what on earth does this have to do with fitness? But trust me, we'll get there. In 1904, in Hanoi, Vietnam, the city was overrun with rats. They were in the streets. It was causing a nightmare for everybody, and so the government decided we have to do something about this, and they started offering citizens money to kill rats. But how they did it was they offered 1 penny per rat tail. So people would go out, kill a rat, mail in the tail of the rat, and they'd get paid a penny. Unfortunately for the citizens of Hanoi, this did not go as planned. The citizens started breeding rats, chopping off their tails, mailing them in for money, but keeping the rats alive and breeding them so they could have a money-making business off of the rat tails. They uncovered smuggling operations, people bringing in rats from out of the city, and no one actually wanted to kill the rats because they just saw it as a money-making scheme. So this goal of getting rid of rats by offering a reward for rat tails obviously backfired. And this is what's known as an example of Goodhart's law, which is when we make a measure a goal, it ceases to be a good measure in the first place. And we see this same phenomenon happen a lot in fitness. For example, with grip strength, we saw a lot of really good data showing that people with stronger grips tended to live longer. So there was this strong association between grip strength and mortality. Unfortunately, you can't just give people captains of crusher grip trainer and have that add years to their life, because what's really going on there is people with stronger grips tend to just lead more active, physically demanding lives. They're stronger, and it's a good proxy measure. So grip strength is a good proxy for overall lean muscle mass. So people with more lean muscle mass who are more physically active live longer. Those people tend to have stronger grips, but we can't make a direct correlation or infer causality between grip strength and longevity. We've also seen it with neck circumference and concussion risk. So in a wide range of high impact collision sports, football, etc., we've seen that athletes with thicker necks tend to get less concussions. And for a while, we had people training their neck, trying to grow their neck, make it as thick as possible to prevent concussions. We later realized that what was happening there was the bigger, stronger, faster athletes just had bigger necks. Those athletes were the ones delivering the hits, the skinny pencil neck kids with the small necks. It wasn't that the neck itself was a problem, they were just the ones getting wrecked on the field. We've seen this pop up time and time again with all sorts of different measures in fitness. So it's very important as a consumer of fitness content or as a fitness professional or fitness enthusiast to be aware of Goodhart's law and its limitations. Now, a lot of people have looked at VO2Max and asked, is this just rat tails and grip strength and neck circumference all over again? Is VO2Max a measure that has become a goal, and is chasing it actually counterproductive? My answer for you is kind of. Compared to some of those other examples, there is a much stronger argument to be made for causality, but I do think it's something where we take it a little bit too far. I'm going to get into that more when we talk about training for health and training for performance, but just be aware of this concept of Goodhart's law and realize that Sometimes when you get so laser focused on improving a very specific measure, like number of rat tails or neck circumference, grip strength, or VO2 max, we might be missing the forest for the trees and forgetting some of the underlying factors that really drive the result we care about. When people talk about VO2 max, it's easy to lose sight of how multifactorial and complex of a measure it really is. It's not just one thing, but it's a measure of how effectively we're able to take oxygen out of the air, how effectively that oxygen can diffuse from our lungs into our bloodstream, how much our blood and hemoglobin can hold that oxygen, how well our heart can pump that blood to working muscles, how many capillaries and how much support in terms of blood vessels we have to get that blood towards the muscle cells, and then how well those muscle cells can extract the oxygen and utilize that oxygen alongside a fuel source for energy during exercise. There's tons of different limiting factors and steps in that process. And so depending on what your goal is, whether you're training for health or performance, or whether you're beginner, intermediate, or advanced, there can be different kind of rate limiting steps or limiting factors to your VO2 max at different points in that oxygen cascade. So if you're looking at a low VO2 max and you want it to be high VO2 max, it's not just this one number that needs to improve. We're talking about dozens, if not hundreds, of physiological processes that are all impacted by training in different ways. While there's dozens, if not hundreds, of individual steps in that oxygen cascade, we can loosely divide it into two main categories: central factors and peripheral factors. Central factors are the types of things where the exercise type doesn't really matter that much, or the working muscles themselves don't matter that much, but what's happening centrally with your heart and your lungs and your blood volume, that stuff matters, and that is what we call central adaptations as it relates to VO2 max. Peripheral adaptations is what's happening on the local muscular level. Adaptations in capillaries around the muscle, adaptations in the muscle fiber or muscle cell itself, and importantly, adaptations to the mitochondria within those muscle cells. Even breaking it into these two main categories, we'll see that there's a lot of different individual components to each. But if I had to pick the most important and most significant factors that you need to be aware of, it is cardiac output as it relates to central factors, which is how much blood your heart can beat, and mitochondrial adaptations as it relates to peripheral factors. Specifically, how many mitochondria do you have? We'll call that mitochondrial volume density, relating to how much of your muscle cell is mitochondria, and then what is the essentially fitness level of each of those mitochondria. We call this mass-specific mitochondrial respiration. It's how powerful are those mitochondria relative to their own mass. So differentiating VO2 max into these two main factors that we're going to talk about today, cardiac output and mitochondrial adaptations, will explain the vast majority of the variance that we see across VO2 max in individuals, and I'm going to talk to you about how we can improve those factors individually to maximize your VO2 max and the performance and health outcomes you might care about too. When you first start a training program, you'll often see very rapid improvements in performance and VO2 max, largely because some of the peripheral adaptations that I just mentioned, specifically mitochondrial adaptations, can happen very, very quickly compared to some of the central adaptations like change in heart size and strength, for example. Mitochondria are really, really cool, especially with regards to how quickly they can adapt to changing stressors. So this section is going to be a brief overview of mitochondrial adaptations. We can roughly divide mitochondrial adaptations into those two halves: volume of mitochondria or density of mitochondria, and then the mass-specific or mitochondrial-specific respiratory power. So how fit are they on an individual basis? We have some really good data on the factors impacting mitochondrial adaptations. The most interesting thing to me as it relates to mitochondrial volume density, so again, how many mitochondria you have, the most interesting part of that to me is that it's very, very strongly related to just total training volume, with little significance coming from training intensity. So whether you're training at 60% or 70% or 80% of your maximum effort for a given duration, it doesn't really seem to matter that much in terms of adaptations to mitochondrial volume. What really matters is just accumulating the work across many weeks, months, and years of training, and just getting the work done or getting the miles in. Now, I can't understate the significance of this fact, because a lot of people with their low intensity training or zone 2 training, they will try to heavily optimize it. They're looking for the perfect power output, the perfect heart rate. They often ask, how do I set my zone 2 heart rate? Is this too slow? Is this too fast? What about fat burn versus carb burn? And ultimately, for adaptations to mitochondrial volume density, those factors don't seem to matter very much, at least in isolation. From a more practical standpoint, if you go really, really slow or really, really conservatively on your easy, more volume-based training, it's just going to take longer to accumulate some of the volumes that you need to see. If you train a little bit too hard, 90%, 100%, and you try to accumulate a lot of volume there, you're just going to run into practical issues with recovery. You're not going to be able to accumulate the type of volume you need either. Ultimately, what matters is you just get the volume in, and if you self-correct over time based on how you personally feel with your recovery and how well you're personally able to accumulate training volume, that's what really matters from a mitochondrial volume density perspective. Now, mitochondrial volume density is not sufficient. You can have a lot of mitochondria that don't function very well, and that's obviously not a good thing. So we need to have some training that improves their individual respiratory power as well. As you can see on this graph that looks at a variety of training interventions from lowest to highest intensity, we see that high intensity training interventions are superior for improving mass-specific respiration. Low intensity and even moderate intensity training just doesn't cut it. We need to see very high intensity or even sprint intensities to see improvements in respiratory power on an individual mitochondrial basis. Now, looking at this graph can be a little bit misleading. I want to acknowledge that it depends on how you create this graph. How you create this graph is going to heavily influence your interpretation of it. We can look at adaptations relative to training volume, or we can look at adaptations relative to training time. What do I mean by that? Well, if you take a sprint training program, for example, you might do a 10-second sprint and then rest for 5 minutes, do that 10 times. That could be an hour of total training time, but only 1 or 2 minutes of real effective training volume. And so if we look at a given amount of mitochondrial adaptation and divide it by an hour-long workout, that's not going to look as impressive as if we divide that by 2 minutes of effective training volume or effective training time. What this means practically is that a wide range of high intensities, from classic kind of VO2Max style intervals all the way up to sprint intensity training, all of those things can improve mitochondrial respiratory power. We can't say just based off of this graph alone that one option is necessarily better than the other. Taking these two graphs from the last two slides together, we have two main variables that matter for optimizing mitochondrial adaptations. We have total training volume, train a lot, and we have training intensity. Sometimes that training has to be hard, but it doesn't require a ton of training volume when the intensity is sufficiently high. This already starts kind of lending itself towards a fairly polarized training model. Train a lot, get a lot of easy zone 1, zone 2, whatever you want to call it, accumulate a lot of volume there, and then train hard enough sometimes to get some of these mitochondrial specific adaptations as well. However, there is one problem with that from a performance perspective at least, and that is the fact that these adaptations are muscle fiber specific. So when we're talking about these adaptations to mitochondria, both in terms of volume density and respiratory power, that only happens in the muscle fibers being trained. When we train at very low intensities, we don't recruit fast twitch muscle fibers, we only recruit some of those slower twitch fibers. That means that when you're accumulating a lot of volume of very easy work, you're improving the mitochondrial volume density of those slow twitch fibers, but not of some of those higher threshold motor units you might care about too. On the other hand, when we do very high intensity training, all of your muscle fibers are going to be recruited to some extent, and so we're going to see that uptick in mitochondrial respiratory power in all of those muscle fibers. That leaves a little bit of a gap for improving mitochondrial volume density in fast twitch muscle fibers. How does that happen? Well, there is a sweet spot in there where this intensity is high enough to recruit faster twitch muscle fibers, but still low enough that it's possible to accumulate a lot of training volume. This is where things like sweet spot or threshold, any sort of moderate to high intensity sustained interval work comes into play. Again, we're able to accumulate a decent amount of volume there, but the intensity is high enough to recruit some of those fast twitch muscle fibers. This now expands into more of a 3-bucket intensity system. We have very low to moderate intensity sustainable work that's great for overall mitochondrial volume density in slow twitch muscle fibers, a higher intensity but still somewhat sustainable intensity domain where we're improving mitochondrial volume density in faster twitch fibers, and then we have very high intensity training that improves mitochondrial respiratory power across a wide range of muscle fibers. That 3-zone system or 3-bucket system I just brought up is going to apply even as we add more nuance to the conversation with cardiovascular and central adaptations. So just know when you see kind of 3-zone models, easy, medium, hard kind of descriptors, that makes a lot of sense even just from a mitochondrial perspective. Mitochondria are great, but blood and oxygen has to get there somehow in the first place. That's where central factors like cardiac output come into play. As I mentioned before, when most people first start a training program, they're probably more limited by some of those peripheral factors, and they'll see rapid improvements in some of those mitochondrial adaptations that we talked about. But eventually, as those adaptations start catching up, they're going to become more centrally limited, and cardiac output becomes the major driver of VO2Max and aerobic performance. With those central factors, cardiac output is the main one that we really care about. And now we're going to further divide cardiac output into 2 more factors, and that is end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. I always get those 2 mixed up. Don't feel like you have to remember them. Instead, just think the stretch and the squeeze. So the 2 factors behind cardiac output is how much can your heart expand, so how much blood can it hold when it's fully expanded, and then how hard can it squeeze or how completely can it empty. Between that stretch and that squeeze, that's going to dictate the total amount of blood that's pumped per beat. Now, the end diastolic volume, or that stretch component, is the most trainable quality of the heart. That can improve significantly with training, often up to doubling compared to an untrained individual. The squeeze component, you'll see some improvements there, often 10 to 15% improvements, but it's not generally the major driver behind long-term improvements in cardiac output. But that improvement in the stretch of the heart, filling of the heart, end diastolic volume, or what we call eccentric left ventricle hypertrophy, so just an increase in chamber size, that's the main thing that we care about in terms of central adaptations. Now, a quick side note here, especially for people who also care about strength training and have experience being very out of breath or having their heart rate go through the roof during a heavy set of squats, I want to address kind of that phenomenon and why it happens. And to do that, we have to think about cardiac output in terms of that stroke volume, so how much blood is being pumped on each beat, times heart rate. So stroke volume times heart rate, that's the total workload or cardiac output of the heart. And those 2 variables can interact. Specifically in conditions where stroke volume or how much blood the heart beats is artificially limited, we can see heart rate try to compensate for that change in stroke volume. With lifting, what we often see is that when muscles are squeezed very, very hard, there is an effect called occlusion, where blood can't flow very well through strongly contracted muscles. Specifically, doing a heavy set of squats, you have a lot of muscle mass contracting really, really hard, and that prevents blood from flowing very well through those muscles and making its way back to the heart. This limits venous return, or how much blood can get back to the heart and how much the heart can fill up with blood and oxygen. And so the heart will compensate for that, and it will spike your heart rate just to try to maintain cardiac output. Under different conditions, like normal cardiovascular training, where muscle contraction is much lower intensity, it's more cyclical, there's more relaxation time for blood to flow unimpeded, that reduction in stroke volume doesn't happen. And in fact, we tend to see a significant increase in stroke volume just with more blood getting back to the heart continuously. So just know that when your heart rate goes up, that doesn't always mean that you're actually increasing cardiac output or increasing overall demand on the cardiovascular system. Sometimes it's just a compensation effect, just like we see with having a panic attack or watching a scary movie or getting very nervous. You can see your heart rate go up very, very high. Same thing with drug use. Do enough caffeine or stimulants, you can see very high heart rate numbers as well. But that's generally because those factors cause a restriction in stroke volume, not because they're making you do more meaningful cardiovascular work. But moving on back to end diastolic volume, or that stretch of the heart, the main driver behind that, just as you might expect, if you think about how other muscles adapt, is exposure to that stretch. If you want to improve your mobility, for example, say in your hamstrings, you need to stretch the hamstrings and expose the hamstring muscles to that lengthened position. The heart is much the same. If you want to see improvements in myocardial stretch or chamber volume, you need to continuously expose the heart to that fully stretched position. To understand how that happens, we have to think about how stroke volume or that filling effect changes as exercise intensity increases. In most people, stroke volume, so how much the heart can expand on each beat, will increase with increasing exercise intensity up to about 50 to 60% of maximum heart rate, and then it doesn't tend to go much higher than that. That means that even easy to moderate intensity exercise is sufficient for getting the heart to fully stretch. And once you're at that point, you just need to accumulate a lot of volume and exposure. And we see this consistently in data that looks at cardiac morphology versus habitual training patterns. And we see that people who just do more training volume tend to have bigger heart chambers, more eccentric left ventricular hypertrophy. So that adaptation we care about is strongly influenced by total training volume. However, that stroke volume plateau effect, where stroke volume increases up to a point and then stops, doesn't apply to everyone. Specifically, highly trained and often elite endurance athletes won't show that plateau at all, and their heart will continue to expand more and more and more, even at higher intensities. Practically, what does this mean? Well, we could make a compelling argument that for better trained athletes, some exposure to some of those higher intensities is going to be important for continuing to move that needle a little bit further. Total training volume still correlates most strongly with changes in cardiac morphology or heart size, but some exposure to much higher intensity intervals is probably important for long-term improvements in cardiac output as well. While total training volume is the most important driver for cardiac remodeling for most people, intensity does play a little bit of a role, especially in the strength or contractility of the hearts, that squeeze effect that we were talking about. Exposure to higher intensity interval training will improve that contractility or the ability of the heart to completely empty on each beat as well. Just like with the mitochondrial adaptations, we saw a need for a lot of sustained low to moderate intensity work and the need for some exposure to much higher intensities. And we see the exact same thing with cardiac adaptations or central adaptations. We need a lot of volume and exposure to that cardiac stretch. And we also want to see some exposure to higher intensities in terms of the squeeze effect too. To reiterate one of the things I said at the beginning of this video, VO2Max is multifactorial and complex. Just looking at the factors I've talked about so far, cardiac output, end-diastolic volume, end-systolic volume, mitochondrial volume density, mitochondrial respiratory power, I'm only beginning to touch on some of the variables that influence VO2Max, and there's many more that I simply don't have time for in this video. But when you think about how all of these factors so far might influence your health, there's a lot of different things to consider. For example, improvements in cardiac output or stroke volume, we could see how that might influence someone's blood pressure, for example, compared to some of the mitochondrial adaptations, more mitochondria to pull glucose and fat out of the bloodstream and metabolize for energy. We could see how that might improve someone's glucose control and insulin sensitivity. Probably a little bit of an oversimplification there, but the point I'm trying to make is that different subcomponents or different factors underlying VO2max and aerobic performance can impact health in different ways. So when we want to ask a question like how important is VO2max for health, we're looking at something that's very complex, very multifactorial like VO2max, and asking how that relates to another very complex multifactorial measure, as opposed to asking how does this specific aspect of fitness or this particular training adaptation relate to this specific component of health. So we're already asking a very complicated question. However, because VO2max is a composite metric, it looks at all of these things kind of put together. It looks at those peripheral adaptations and central adaptations and even motivational kind of neurological factors behind exercise performance and your ability to push hard in a VO2max test. Because it captures a lot of that under just one number, it's a very, very powerful measure, and it correlates really well with a lot of the health outcomes that we care about. In fact, VO2max is the strongest predictor we have of all-cause mortality. Stronger than smoking status, stronger than drinking status, stronger than socioeconomic status. It's really remarkable just what a powerful predictor it is of some of these health outcomes when looking at large populations, comparing the people with the highest VO2 max, the highest quintile, versus the lowest quintile, so that bottom 20% in terms of aerobic fitness. We see hazard ratios often above 4, so like 300% plus more likely to die if you're in the lowest fitness category versus the highest. And again, that's much stronger than almost any other data we have. However, that has led people to making some very strong claims about VO2 max as an intervention for specific individuals. I think at this point, it's very important to differentiate between population level data and individual data. So just because something applies to a population on average doesn't mean it always applies to every individual person on their own. We already mentioned Goodhart's law, the rat tails, and so on and so forth. So keep that in mind. I'm going to go through some other reasons why VO2 max may have been overemphasized, and then hopefully I'll leave you guys with a little bit of a middle ground perspective. Now, you've probably seen graphs like this one. This is that chart I was talking about where the highest fitness levels, I think the orange line here, these people have the best health outcomes, the best 20-year survival compared to the lowest fitness quintile. Those people have the worst 20-year survival outcomes. Now, this is pretty powerful stuff, and if you just see a graph like this, it can make you very motivated to go get your VO2 max tested, for example, and see how you stack up. However, there's one very important thing that these graphs don't tell you, and that's that they're not actually measuring VO2 max in the first place. That's right, all of these studies that you've heard about on different podcasts telling you about VO2 max, none of them actually test VO2 max. So what the heck is going on? Well, VO2 max to test properly with a mask, a metabolic cart, is very expensive, time consuming, and hard to do for the hundreds of thousands of people often included in these studies. So instead, they just estimate VO2 max based off of their fitness level. Usually they'll have people do a treadmill test, see how fast they can walk or run on the treadmill, or they'll do a sub-maximal cycling test is another common protocol used, where they'll just have people cycle at a fixed power output and see how much their heart rate increases in response to that cycling demand. And from that data, they'll estimate what their VO2 max is. This is a reasonably accurate way to do it, but it does introduce a significant amount of error. Oftentimes, the correlation between actual VO2 max and performance proxy tests is only 0.7 to 0.8, so there is a good bit of noise in the data. What does that mean for you? Well, you may not need to know your VO2 max or care about your VO2 max at all if you just care about your performance. Interestingly, when we look at data comparing actual VO2 max studies versus predicted VO2 max studies, including ones that use maximal and submaximal fitness, we actually see very good agreement in terms of the actual health outcomes. Even if VO2 max isn't a perfect predictor for performance and vice versa, it seems that no matter how we slice it or how we measure cardio fitness, whether with a max test, submaximal test, gas exchange, metabolic cart test, or even just a composite metric that uses a bunch of different survey questions along with someone's BMI and resting heart rate, we can get really, really good agreement across all of those tests for predicting mortality. In fact, there's one survey measure or one survey-based test called the YRCA formula, I believe, maybe the JRCA formula, and it was actually a little bit stronger of a predictor of all-cause mortality than even directly measuring VO2 max itself. And all they did was look at someone's resting heart rate, their BMI, so their height and weight, and then rank their physical activity, self-reported on a scale of 1 to 5, essentially asking, did they exercise a little bit, not at all, or a ton? And then that alone was enough to predict their mortality. So while VO2 max charts like this one are very powerful, and it's cool to see just what a strong predictor VO2 max is of mortality, when we can say that just overall physical activity levels from some of these survey data and body composition are as good of a predictor as the real thing, it does undercut, how seriously we should take some of the claims about VO2 max itself and some of the VO2 maxing protocols that we see promoted today. Another potential argument against chasing VO2 max is the divergence of VO2max and other health metrics that we might care about. And studies that have given people training programs and looked at their VO2max response to that training program, along with improvements to their blood pressure and glucose control and so on and so forth, these studies have found that there's often weak to no correlation at all between who improves their VO2max and who improves those other health measures. For example, you might do a training program and see significant VO2max improvements without improvements in your blood pressure, or you might do a training program and see that your blood pressure improved, but your VO2max did not. And so when we see this sort of divergence between cardiorespiratory fitness measures like VO2max or performance and other health outcomes, we have to ask, does VO2max actually matter that much on an individual level if it can diverge so wildly with all sorts of other health measures that we care about? My follow-up question to something like that would be, does training with the intent to improve VO2max really matter the most? So for example, does just doing a training program with the intent to improve fitness give you the best shot at improving some of those other health metrics that we might care about? And as we'll see in a little bit, the answer is, I'm not very sure. This stuff is inherently messy, very difficult to kind of parse out the independent factors. But at the end of the day, we are generally leaning towards thinking that just training hard, getting some exposure to high stress physical exertion is probably more important than the actual number on the screen or your ability to demonstrate performance at a specific task. Some people have also used genetic studies of VO2max to argue against its importance, and I think that that might not be the best approach. In this study, they found that the genetic component of VO2max, so just your baseline propensity to have a high or low VO2max, didn't actually matter for longevity much at all. Some people have used that to argue that VO2max itself doesn't matter much at all, but when we look at that alongside the other data we have, knowing that overall VO2max tends to be a strong predictor of mortality, but your genetic baseline doesn't matter, to me that only strengthens the argument that training-induced changes, physical activity-induced changes, or environment-induced changes are what really matter the most. We have other data backing up the idea that your genetic baseline doesn't really matter. It's probably just your change over time. We even have studies that track individuals and follow up over 10 to 20 years and find that people who have the biggest increase in VO2max over that follow-up period tend to have the best health outcomes as well. So if anything, I think some of these genetic studies and also individual long-term follow-up studies actually strengthen the argument that improvements in VO2max are probably important, although it still doesn't fully reconcile the fact that VO2max can move independently of some of those other health metrics that we care about. People will also look at genetics of VO2max and say things like your genetics have kind of predetermined your VO2max, so how much does training it really matter? And I think this also is not the best way to think about it. In the famous heritage study, they looked at within family and between family responses to a training program, and they estimated that the genetic component of VO2max trainability was approximately 47%. However, there's a few flaws with this study. For all of its strengths, it did get a few things wrong that I think we need to address. First, they only looked at one exercise program and one dose. It was a relatively low intensity, low dose program, about 90 minutes per week of very low intensity training overall compared to what most people would call difficult cardio training. I believe they started around 55% of VO2max for the intensity, which is very, very easy. And so they essentially, again, looked at one exercise program, one dose, and concluded things about the genetic component of VO2max trainability. Imagine if we did that with anything else. Like, imagine we're testing a blood pressure medication, and we gave people one medication at one dose that wasn't really properly individualized to the individual either, and then we decided 50% of your ability to lower your blood pressure is genetic. There's other medications you could take. There's other ways to administer a dose. That's, I think, getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit. Follow-up research that has looked at prescribing exercise programs differently. So instead of prescribing exercise as a percentage of VO2max, but as a percentage of lactate threshold, those studies have found a more uniform response across individuals. Other studies have also found that when the exercise dose is just higher overall, that the response again is uniform and we tend to eliminate non-responders. Lastly, some people that don't respond well to low intensity training programs respond extra well to higher intensity training programs and vice versa. Some people don't respond well to sprint intensity training programs, but respond really well to low to moderate intensity continuous training programs. When we account for individualization of exercise intensity as a percentage of lactate threshold, when we account for that kind of responder phenotyping, so do you respond well to low versus high intensity, and when we account for the uniformity in response we tend to see at higher doses of exercise, I think it's hard to say that this study is the end-all be-all or has the final say in terms of the genetic components of VO2max trainability. I do believe that it's still largely genetic, especially in terms of what types of training programs will work best for you and at what doses will you see a good response. But when it comes to your ability to improve your VO2max, or when it comes to what your potential genetic ceiling for VO2max is, I think we've probably overestimated what that genetic component really is. But do your genetics for VO2max really even matter? I don't think so. When we look at some of the data we've talked about so far, like the divergence between VO2max and other health measures, and we see that genetic baseline for VO2max doesn't really predict health outcomes anyway, I think that what really matters the most is just exercise with the intent to improve. That high stress exercise is going to stimulate the adaptations that we care about. Some people will improve their VO2max more, some people will improve their health more, but right now we don't have any clear way of knowing how do we individualize different training interventions for people who respond in particular ways. For example, if we give you a very difficult training program and see that your VO2max improved a lot, but your health did not, we don't have a strong way of knowing how we need to modify that training program to move the needle more for you in terms of health, other than just try different options that you haven't yet. Maybe your VO2max moved really well in response to high intensity, but your health measures didn't. Maybe if we add some low intensity training to your program, we'll see some of those health measures start to move as well. What I would suggest is taking an individualized risk factor based approach where you're not just focused on trying to improve your VO2max, but you take a more holistic approach and track a wide range of health metrics. Keep an eye on your blood pressure, get regular blood work done, and pay attention to how these numbers move as you go through different training programs. If you find that your health isn't where you want it to be and you have certain risk factors, consider adjusting your training program, training at a higher intensity or training at a higher volume, or trying different styles of training and seeing if that has an impact on those health measures. Again, you might feel like you're doing a lot in one area but not seeing the results that you want. You might just be someone who responds better to a different type of training, especially for specific risk factors. Ultimately, all that I can confidently say is that cardiovascular fitness, as measured by VO2max, some of these other health measures like your blood pressure, so on and so forth, overall physical activity level outside of the gym, and exercise stress, just exposure to hard training regardless of the fitness improvement, all of those things are independent factors that have the potential to impact your health. We can't focus on one and forget about the others. Importantly, for someone who just naturally has very high aerobic fitness, you're just born with a VO2max of 65 and with no training at all, you can run a sub 6-minute mile. You are not fully protected from being sedentary or from a lack of physical activity and exercise just because you have those good genetics. Similarly, if you're someone who has terrible genetics for fitness, your VO2max is 30, and no matter how hard you train, you're not getting faster, that doesn't mean that the exercise you're doing is not still very, very good for you. Regardless of baseline genetics, regardless of VO2max or performance, exercise and hard training is good for your health. Hopefully you now have a better understanding of how VO2max relates to your health. Next, we're going to talk about VO2max and performance, so follow me out to the gym, we'll dive in. I hope you guys are enjoying the video so far. Before we move on, quick plug for some of my programs. If you're not sure how to incorporate cardio into a program yourself, I have a wide range of programs for you to choose from. Everything from 5K to half marathon and marathon programs, beginner and advanced options, as well as cardio programs just for general physical preparation and heart health. If you want to check out some of those programs, link is in the description below. When we talk about VO2max in terms of health, What we're really referring to is just overall cardiovascular fitness. As I mentioned before, when we're talking about health, VO2 max is often measured in terms of just maximal exercise performance, sub-maximal performance on a bike like this, and they're often not actually referring to real VO2 max measured with an analyzer like this. But when it comes to VO2 max and performance, we're a lot more specific. VO2 max, as it relates to performance, always references actual gas exchange metabolic cart data from an analyzer like this one, or even a more sophisticated analyzer at like a university or sports performance lab. It's important to differentiate between the two because when we just think about VO2 max in terms of performance proxies, that's a lot different than understanding it as an individual performance limiter to be differentiated from things like lactate threshold or movement economy or durability. So VO2 max, and being very specific about a gas exchange analyzer like this one, is that understanding VO2 max and correctly identifying it as a performance limiter or not, individualizing your training approach to address the performance limiters unique to you, that's how you get into really, really good shape and maximize your own genetics for performance. So from this point forward, when I talk about VO2 max, I'm talking about the real thing, not just a performance proxy like in our conversation of health. So how much does VO2 max matter for performance? Well, the answer to that question depends on what sort of population we're looking at. If we zoom out and look at big populations, for example, there's some good data on running the 2 mile, and it looked at VO2 max versus 2 mile run performance. It found that when you zoom out far enough, VO2 max correlates really, really strongly with 2 mile run time. That's if we're looking at times ranging from like 15 minutes all the way down to like 9 minutes. Across that really wide range of fitness levels, VO2 max emerges as one of the biggest determining factors for running performance. However, if you zoom in and you just look at people and their immediate peers, so for example, look at elite runners only, and then look at their VO2 max, you'll see that VO2 max doesn't seem to predict or separate those elite athletes much at all. So if you're already running sub 9 minutes for 2 miles, you might get beat by someone with a significantly lower VO2 max than you, and you might be able to improve yourself without actually improving your VO2 max much at all. A classic example is Paula Radcliffe, the former female world record holder in the marathon. She went through extensive lab testing throughout her career, and over the span of many, many years, her VO2 max didn't change at all the while she took over 10 minutes off her marathon time and eventually set a world record. So VO2 max definitely matters, but it's not sufficient on its own, and there's other very important performance limiters that you have to account for as well if you want to maximize your performance long term. That being said, VO2 max can be one of those things that deserves your direct attention, and some people have kind of underweighted it, and all they care about is threshold and movement economy and race-specific workouts, and they ignore how focused work on raising VO2 max specifically can provide a good base from which you can improve threshold, improve some of those other qualities as well. So when I'm working with an athlete, identifying strengths and weaknesses, we may determine that VO2 max is more or less of a performance limiter for them specifically, and we may do more or less work on this quality depending on what their strengths and weaknesses are. So is VO2 max the end-all be-all for performance? No, but it is definitely something, and if you do a proper strengths and weaknesses analysis of your athletes, you may find that VO2 max is indeed worth focusing on. That being said, VO2 max is a very physiologically based way to think about training, and that's not the only way to think about some of these things. For example, some coaches won't reference things like VO2 max or even threshold much at all. They'll just take a purely performance-based approach and say, hey, you're not very good at short duration efforts, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, compared to how good you are at longer efforts like 45, 60-minute efforts. We're going to spend more time bringing up that top end. That could be a very performance-focused way of saying your VO2 max is more of a limiting factor than your fractional utilization, for example. And I think both approaches can work, whether you're more physiologically based or more performance and percentage based. I think both of those can lead to the same end destination in terms of understanding what your athlete's strengths and weaknesses are in terms of, or compared to, sort of population normative averages. Now, when it comes to identifying some of these strengths and weaknesses, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One, you can look at population norms or distributions. So if you have an athlete, I'll use myself as an example, I want to run a sub 2:30 marathon. How do I determine if VO2Max is a potential limiting factor for me? Well, I can look at sort of the normal distribution for VO2Max among 2:30 marathoners. What is a normal VO2Max? Knowing that there is going to be some bell curve or widespread. Am I on the bottom end of that curve? You know, am I essentially going to have to be the most economical, have the best fractional utilization, be the best at all the other things because my VO2Max is low? Or am I already in the top end of that bell curve? Do I already have a very high VO2Max compared to other 2:30 marathoners? If I identify that my VO2Max is already quite high relative to other 2:30 marathoners, that at least gives me a probabilistic way of thinking about it. And I can probably say, on average, or probabilistically, that's not my limiting factor. I should focus on other things. On the other hand, if my VO2Max is on the low end compared to other 2:30 marathoners, it's possible that that VO2Max number doesn't have to move, but there's also a higher probability that trying to address that limiting factor is going to set me up for success more effectively. That's one piece of the equation, but again, it's more just probabilistic in nature. The other way to think about it is past training exposure. How much have some of these numbers moved from baseline? So if I've done a lot of VO2Max style training, if I focus on that for a long time, and I haven't done some of the other type of stuff, sometimes just the stuff I haven't done as much is probably going to pay off a little bit more. So rather than think of strengths and weaknesses in terms of comparing yourself to others, think about strengths and weaknesses in terms of historical training exposures. And then last but not least, you have the fuck around and find out method, which is just what sort of training do you actually respond well to? And so give an athlete a certain style of training for 12 weeks, 16 weeks, whatever it is, assess the response, see how they respond to different training blocks over years and years of training, and you'll develop an intuition for the athlete or for yourself, and you'll be able to know when you think it's time to do a certain type of training that you've responded well to in the past. Taking all of those things into account together is what makes coaching more of an art than a science, because there's so many little things that you have to consider, along with athlete preference, among other things, for knowing when you might want to focus on VO2Max work specifically. What is VO2Max work? Well, that's the next part, but I'm too out of breath for that. As a quick sidebar, some people will say VO2Max doesn't matter. What actually matters is your VO2Max, or your velocity at VO2Max. So when you're at your VO2Max, how fast are you biking or running or whatever it is? And I see what people are trying to get at with that claim, but it doesn't actually make a lot of sense, because there's really no such thing as VO2Max, because different speeds, different intensities can all result in hitting VO2Max depending on the duration. There's what we call a fast component and a slow component to oxygen demand or oxygen kinetics. And when you're going at a given intensity close to VO2Max, or traditional V at VO2Max, we'll call it, your oxygen demand will drift up over time. And so if you go a little bit slower, in some cases, we've seen athletes running half marathon pace eventually hit VO2Max due to the slow component of VO2. Similarly, athletes can run much faster than that. They could run 1 mile pace or 3K race pace, and they'll also hit VO2Max. They'll just hit it much sooner. So sometimes people will say VO2Max is the slowest speed that can elicit VO2Max, but I don't think people fully appreciate just how slow of a pace or how low of a power output will actually eventually lead to hitting VO2Max given sufficient duration. So rather than think of VO2Max or velocity at VO2Max, you should really think of a VO2Max elicitation zone, which is surprisingly wide. And that's why the physiologically based training model, or the idea that training at VO2 max is the best way to improve VO2 max already seems to be a little bit flawed, because very different workout structures, 600-meter repeats at mile pace with 1 to 2 minute rest versus 1,500-meter repeats at 10K pace. Those workouts all have the potential to elicit VO2 max and the potential to accrue a lot of time at VO2 max. So when it comes to VO2 max training, I don't think that there's a specific workout or a specific protocol or a specific speed that is best for training a VO2 max, because a wide range of sufficiently hard training is all VO2 max training in some form or another, especially as it relates to accruing time near maximum capacity. So when it comes to training for VO2 max improvement, there's a lot of studies that we've seen popularized on social media and podcasts lately, such as the Norwegian 4x4 method. It's a famous workout that involves doing 4 minutes near maximum effort, a 4-minute break times 4 sets. And it's true that this workout protocol improves VO2 max very substantially in a relatively short amount of time. We've seen other workout programs like this over the last several decades, even as far back as the 70s with the Hickson protocol. We saw one of the largest, I think the largest ever VO2 max improvement in a training cohort of all time. In that protocol, they alternated between a 40-minute time trial run and an all-out bike interval session every single day. So they would run all out for 40 minutes. The next day, they'd do all-out bike intervals. The next day, they'd run all out for 40 minutes. The next day, bike intervals, and so on. They did that 6 days a week. On the 7th day, they did a VO2 max test, and then they did that for 10 consecutive weeks. And the cool thing about that program was, one, it was the largest ever VO2 max improvement we've seen across a cohort on average. But two, after the 10 weeks, all the participants were so cooked, they tried to get them to keep going, and they all said no. And that's something I don't think people fully appreciate when it comes to some of these VO2 maxing protocols, is they're inherently unsustainable and impractical for long periods of time. If you do the Norwegian 4x4 3 times a week, you might get really great results for 6 to 8 weeks, beyond which you're gonna have trouble continuing that progression. You're gonna plateau, and you're gonna realize that you've probably neglected some other fitness qualities that are important for your long-term progression. So when it comes to improving your VO2 max long-term, you don't want one magic protocol that's gonna improve it a lot in 8 weeks. You want something sustainable that gives you a program and a path to train for years and years. Because even in some of these very impressive protocols like Norwegian 4x4 or the Hickson protocol, even then we don't see VO2 max improvements as large as we've seen individual athletes achieve through years and years of training. For example, some athletes over the span of 5 to 10 years of competitive training, they can see their VO2 max more than double compared to some of the more modest changes that we see in some of these 8 to 12 week training interventions. And they did that without following a singular specific magic workout protocol. They just stuck to the fundamentals. They accrued large amounts of easy volume. They did a wide variety of high intensity training intervals. They had race specific work at moderate intensities. They did all of those things, the fundamentals well, for a long period of time. And there's no substitute for that, even in terms of improving your VO2 max long-term. So when it comes to VO2 maxing protocols like the Norwegian 4x4, I don't see any reason why someone should be worried about how much they can improve their VO2 max in 8 weeks, because life is not an 8-week study. You need to set yourself up for long-term success. In terms of building a program for long-term success, we certainly can have blocks throughout the year where you focus a little bit more on VO2 max as an individual performance limiter. Most athletes are going to have some exposure to the high intensity training that elicits VO2 max in their program regularly throughout the year, but there may be distinct blocks where you push that high intensity work extra hard or really dial in your intervals to optimize the amount of time that you spend there. Doing workouts like the 4x4 or other interval programs that allow you to accumulate a lot of volume near maximum effort can be a very effective, potent way to address that side of the performance coin, elevate kind of your top end capacity. That will generally make it a little bit easier. You won't feel like there's as firm of a ceiling on moving some of those other qualities, like your lactate threshold, for example, your aerobic threshold, you may find that you can move some of those benchmarks up a little bit more easily if you have a higher max speed, so to speak. If you want to do something like that, if you want to do a dedicated VO2Max block, you certainly can. Just be aware that it tends to be relatively fatiguing. It's not something that I would try to do in your program year round. Instead, I choose a time period of 6 to 12 weeks, do some very high intensity work 2-3 times a week, whether that's a workout like the 4x4 or some sort of modified workout where you're accumulating 15 to 25 minutes near max effort across the workout. Do that, like I said, a couple times a week, 6 to 12 weeks, but then periodize, move on and work on some of those other qualities as well. It's not sustainable, nor is it something you're going to enjoy trying to focus on 12 months out of the year. As a general guideline, I recommend progressing from general to specific throughout a training program. If your goal event or the race you're training for example, requires you to spend a lot of time near VO2Max, so it's something like a 5K, for example, or a 10K, I would recommend setting some of the VO2Max work in your program a little bit closer to that event date. Work on some of the fundamentals, like your overall aerobic capacity, zone 1, zone 2 stuff, maybe some of your top end speed as well. Qualities that are important, but a little bit less specific to that event, and then kind of funnel towards some of the VO2Max and more race-specific work closer to the event date. On the other hand, if you're doing a much shorter event or a much longer event like the marathon, where you're probably not spending a lot of time near VO2Max, but instead spending more time near threshold or sub-threshold intensities, that periodization or progression model would be inverted. Moving from general to specific might look like doing some VO2Max style work early on in the season, very far away from your goal event, and then transitioning towards more threshold and sub-threshold work later on as that event approaches. Regardless, I wouldn't be focusing on VO2Max style training all the time, but think about where it will best fit in your year based on what you're training for. So the question remains, should you actually get your VO2Max tested? I've personally administered several hundred VO2Max tests over the course of my career, and a lot of people ask me, is it worth it getting tested? And I'll be the first to tell you that for a lot of people, it's not actually a good idea. From a health standpoint, if you're interested in getting your VO2Max tested, what I've seen in my experience from testing hundreds of general population clientele, I found that VO2Max testing is actually great for general population, even though they don't necessarily need to know the number to dial in their training. I found that when people see the number, they often get very motivated and very excited to put in some work and actually see that number improve. Sometimes for those types of people, seeing performance gains, like, especially if they're using like an elliptical, for example, or a stationary bike, moving from a level 12 to level 13 on the resistance doesn't really mean anything to them or get them fired up about training the way that taking minutes off my marathon time means to me. But when someone like that comes back in for an assessment, they see their VO2Max improve by a couple of points, it's really exciting for them and they can confidently know they're moving in the right direction. That being said, as we mentioned earlier, your VO2Max number itself doesn't really matter, nor does it have to improve for you to experience the health benefits of exercise. So if you're already motivated from a general health standpoint to put in the work and do the hard training that's going to be good for your health, there's really no need to know what that number actually is. So in terms of actually measuring VO2Max from a general health standpoint, I guess I'm a little bit conflicted. I have seen people get very excited and motivated on account of seeing the number, and on that hand, I think it's great, but I don't want to have people spend money that they could otherwise be spending on things that are going to move the needle on their health more. So if you're someone who's kind of cash strapped and you're thinking, man, I don't know if I want to shell out $100, $200, whatever it is for a VO2Max test, certainly don't feel like you have to do it. You can just go do the training and rest assured it's going to be great for your health. From a performance standpoint, it's a little bit different, and I think we could make a slightly stronger case for getting your VO2Max tested just from a identifying strengths and weaknesses standpoint. However, I can see this backfire really quickly as well. For example, a lot of athletes, even if they know all of the things I've said in this video about VO2Max and performance, they understand that there is a strong genetic component behind it, and they'll often kind of put limitations on themselves based on what they find that number to be. if an athlete comes in and they're training for a really aggressive goal and they find out their VO2 max is on the really low side for what that goal requires, that can be really discouraging and psychologically harmful for that athlete. And I don't think that necessarily knowing that number is going to change their training that much more than some sort of performance-based assessment where we can identify you need to work on these elements of your performance without actually testing the physiological factors underpinning those weak spots. On the other hand, this could work as a placebo in the other direction. For example, I'm training for a sub 2:30 marathon. I went in, got my VO2 max tested, and was actually shocked that it was 71, which is really quite excellent. And I think there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to run a sub 2:30 marathon with a VO2 max that high. So for me, it was actually motivating, and I thought, well, shoot, why haven't I been running this fast all along? And so I could see a VO2 max test being psychologically helpful for someone like that, but there's no way to know which direction it's going to go until the test is complete. Ultimately, can you make smart choices for yourself and for your athletes based on performance data alone? Absolutely. But if you want to have things just an extra bit dialed in, getting a test done can just be that 1% edge on having a comprehensive panel for your athlete. I don't want to oversell it or overhype it. I don't think anyone should watch this video and suddenly want to rush out and schedule a VO2 max test. But if you're motivated, if you have the means and you think it's fun, it's probably not going to be harmful in most cases unless you're worried about the possible nocebo of your VO2 max being lower than you'd hoped. Thanks for watching, everybody. Obviously, performance is very complex, lots to talk about beyond just VO2 max. So stay tuned, subscribe for more videos. I'll be diving into other performance limiters like lactate threshold, for example, in future videos. Until next time, thanks.